There is a moment in the historical record that stops you cold. You are reading Tacitus, one of Rome's greatest historians, a man who wrote with precision and with care, a man who understood that history was not just the record of battles and treaties, but the record of what human beings did to each other and why. And Tacitus is describing a morning in 61 CE on the shores of the Menai Strait in Wales. A Roman army on one side of the water, something waiting for them on the other. He describes what the Roman soldiers saw when they looked across at the opposite shore. The thing that stops you is not what he describes. It is what he says the Roman soldiers did when they saw it. They froze. The hesitation of men calculating odds. The pause of an army awaiting orders. The kind of freezing that happens when something reaches past training and past experience and past everything you thought you understood about the world and touches something deeper, something older, something that the rational mind has no category for. These were Roman legionaries, men who had marched across 3 continents, men who had fought Carthaginians and Parthians and Germanic tribes and every variety of human ferocity the ancient world could produce. Men who had watched their comrades die in every way that a human being can die and had kept moving. They looked across the Menai Strait and they could not move. What they saw was the Druids. And what happened next on that shore and in the decades before and after it is one of the strangest and darkest and most thoroughly buried stories in all of Western history. A story about a civilization that the most powerful empire in the ancient world considered dangerous enough to hunt to extinction. A story about knowledge that died with the people who held it. A story about what we lost when Rome won. This is the real story of the Druids. Before we can understand what the Romans destroyed, we have to understand what the Druids actually were. Because they have been so thoroughly mythologized, first by the Romans who misrepresented them, then by the medieval writers who have remembered them, then by the Romantic-era revivalists who reinvented them entirely, that the real institution is almost invisible beneath the layers of projection. The Druids were not a religion in the way that modern Western minds typically conceive of religion. They were not priests of a specific deity or keepers of a specific sacred text. They were something more complex and more powerful than that. They were the intellectual class of the Celtic world. The Celtic peoples occupied most of Western and Central Europe for centuries before Roman expansion began to push against them. They were in Gaul, modern France. They were in the Iberian Peninsula. They were in the British Isles. They were in the Danube Valley and Anatolia, in places that had no name yet that we would recognize. They were a diverse and dispersed people sharing a family of languages, a set of cultural practices, and a social organization that included, at its apex, the institution of the Druids. Celtic society was stratified in the way that most ancient societies were stratified. At the top were kings and warrior aristocrats. Below them were farmers and craftsmen and traders. And running through the entire structure, cutting across political boundaries, holding a position of authority that was simultaneously religious and legal and intellectual and political, were the Druids. Julius Caesar, who spent 8 years fighting the Celtic Gauls and understood them better than almost any other Roman writer, described the Druids with a level of respect that he rarely accorded to Rome's enemies. He said that they held authority over all religious matters, that they performed sacrifices, that they settled disputes, that they determined the calendar, and that they were exempt from military service and from taxation. He said that young men came from across Gaul to study with them. He said that the training lasted up to 20 years. 20 years. Think about what that means in practical terms. A young man begins his training when he is perhaps 15 or 16 years old. He will not complete it until he is in his mid-30s. For those 20 years, he is memorizing, not writing. The Druids did not commit their sacred knowledge to writing, memorizing. The entire body of Druidic knowledge, the legal codes, the religious rituals, the histories, the astronomical calculations, the medical knowledge, the sacred poetry existed only in human memory. Caesar specifically noted that the Druids refused to write their sacred knowledge down. He offered an explanation that he found plausible. They did not want their knowledge to fall into the hands of outsiders, and that they believed writing weakened memory. Both of these reasons are probably correct. But there is something else that the refusal to write implies. If knowledge exists only in memory, it dies when the people who hold it die. There is no archive to raid, no library to consult, no text to translate. The only way to possess Druidic knowledge was to spend 20 years acquiring it from someone who already had it. And the only way to destroy it completely was to kill everyone who held it. The Romans understood this. Eventually, the world that the Druids inhabited was not the primitive world that Roman propaganda described. The Celts of the Iron Age were sophisticated in ways that the Roman literary tradition consistently underestimated, and that archaeology has progressively revealed. Their metalwork was extraordinary. The Latin style that archaeologists associate with the Iron Age Celts produced objects of beauty and technical accomplishment that still astonish specialists today. The Battersea Shield, found in the Thames and now in the British Museum, is a masterpiece of decorative metalwork. Its swirling bronze patterns achieved by techniques that took generations to develop. The Snettisham Torques, massive twisted gold neck rings found in Norfolk, represent a standard of goldsmithing that the Roman world admired. Their social organization was complex. Their legal systems were sophisticated, the Brehon laws of Ireland, which preserved elements of the broader Celtic legal tradition. Fill multiple volumes when transcribed and deal with everything from property rights to personal injury compensation to the obligations of hospitality with a precision and a nuance that suggests centuries of development. Their astronomical knowledge was significant. The Coligny calendar, a bronze tablet found in France in 1897, records a 5-year cycle of months in a Celtic calendar that demonstrates sophisticated tracking of lunar and solar cycles. Whoever created it understood the relationship between the lunar month and the solar year well enough to design a system that kept them synchronized over multi-year periods. And running through all of this, the metalwork, the law, the astronomy, the oral literature, the religious practice was the Druidic institution, trained for 20 years, holding the accumulated knowledge of a civilization in human memory, crossing political boundaries that divided Celtic tribes from each other. This is what made the Druids dangerous to Rome, not their religious practices, not their rituals. The fact that they were a transnational institution with authority that operated above the level of individual tribes and kingdoms. An institution that could coordinate resistance across tribal boundaries. An institution that could not be undermined by reading its texts because it had no texts. An institution whose authority rested not on political power or military force, but on knowledge, and on the reverence that knowledge commanded. When Caesar wanted to pacify Gaul, the Druids were the thing that made pacification difficult. They could move between tribes and be received with respect everywhere. They could frame resistance to Rome in terms that the Celtic religious worldview made compelling. It could keep alive the idea that the Celtic peoples had an identity that was worth fighting for. Caesar did not write about wanting to destroy the Druids. He wrote about wanting to understand them, but his conquest of Gaul, whatever its stated purposes, systematically dismantled the social structure within which the Druids operated. What did the Druids believe? What were the rituals that so disturbed the Romans and that Roman writers described with such a combination of horror and fascination? The central belief that multiple Roman sources agree on, and that modern Celtic scholarship has increasingly confirmed through analysis of Irish and Welsh texts, is the transmigration of souls. The idea that the soul does not die with the body, but moves on, entering another form, perhaps human, perhaps animal, continuing its existence through multiple lives. Caesar noted this belief specifically and offered what is still considered an astute analysis of its military implications. If you genuinely believe that death is not an ending, that what appears to be death is simply a transition to another form of existence, then the calculation of whether to fight to the death against overwhelming odds changes entirely. The extraordinary bravery of Celtic warriors, which Roman sources documented consistently and with genuine respect, may have been rooted in part in this belief. You cannot fully terrorize people who do not believe they can be permanently destroyed. The natural world was sacred. The oak was the most sacred tree. The word Druid itself is connected in most scholarly analyses. Two roots, meaning something like knowledge of the oak or great wisdom. Mistletoe growing on oak trees was considered to have extraordinary power, healing properties, protective properties, the ability to open the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds. It was harvested with a golden sickle at specific times of year, cut so that it did not touch the ground, caught in a white cloth. Water was sacred. Springs, rivers, and lakes were places where the boundary between this world and the other world was thin. The practice of depositing valuable objects in water, weapons, jewelry, ornaments, was widespread across the Celtic world and appears to have been a form of offering to the powers that inhabited those liminal spaces. The spectacular objects found in rivers and bogs across Britain and Ireland, objects too valuable to have been lost accidentally, are the material record of this practice. The sacred calendar divided the year into 4 major festivals and 4 lesser ones. Samhain, at the end of October, was the most important, the beginning of the Celtic year, the time when the boundary between the living and the dead was thinnest, when the spirits of the dead could return, and when dangerous supernatural forces moved freely through the world. Fires were lit on hilltops. The normal rules of the world were suspended. Imbolc, in early February, marked the first stirring of spring, associated with the goddess Bridget, and with the renewal of the land after winter. Beltane, at the beginning of May, was a great fire festival. Cattle were driven between fires to purify them. The first of the summer season's outdoor life began. Lughnasadh in August was the harvest festival, a time of games and assemblies, and the first fruits offered to the gods. These festivals are not entirely gone from the modern world. Samhain became Halloween, Imbolc became Candlemas. Beltane survives in May Day traditions across Europe. Lughnasadh gave its name to the August festivals of rural Ireland that persist to the present day. The calendar that the Druids tended has proven more durable than the empire that tried to replace it. And then there is the darker side, the side that the Roman sources dwelt on, the side that has made the Druids simultaneously fascinating and troubling to every generation that has studied them. The Romans described human sacrifice as a central element of Druidic ritual. They described it in detail. Strabo, writing in the 1st century BCE, described Druidic diviners stabbing a victim in the back and reading omens from the death throes. Diodorus Siculus described the same practice. Caesar described criminals being imprisoned for years and then burned in enormous wickerwork. Figures the Wicker Man as mass offerings to the gods. He said that when criminals were not available in sufficient numbers, innocent people were used instead. These accounts have been argued about ever since they were written. The Romans had obvious reasons to exaggerate the brutality of their enemies. Conquest is easier to justify when the conquered people are portrayed as savages who need to be civilized. The Romans, who described Druidic human sacrifice, also organized gladiatorial combats in which thousands of people died for public entertainment. So the moral high ground they claimed was always complicated for most of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Scholars tended to discount the Roman accounts of Druidic human sacrifice as propaganda. Celtic culture, viewed through the lens of the Romantic revival that had reinvented the Druids as noble nature priests, could not have included such practices. The accounts were Roman lies, and the archaeologists started digging. Lindow Moss is a peat bog in Cheshire, England. Peat bogs are extraordinarily good at preserving organic material. The acidic, oxygen-poor environment of the bog prevents the decomposition that destroys evidence in other soil types. Bodies found in peat bogs can retain skin and internal organs and stomach contents after thousands of years. In 1984, a peat cutting machine at Lindow Moss cut through something that turned out to be a human body. The body became known as Lindow Man. He was a man in his mid-20s. He was well-nourished, significantly better fed than the average person of his era. His bones and teeth suggesting a diet of quality that indicated social status. He had manicured nails. He had been groomed with care shortly before his death. He had been killed in a very specific way. He had been struck twice on the top of the head with a narrow-bladed weapon. The blows had fractured his skull. He had been garroted. A cord around his neck had been twisted tight enough to break one of his neck vertebrae. And he had been held face down in the shallow water at the edge of the bog until he drowned. 3 methods of killing, applied simultaneously or in rapid succession. The triple death. His stomach contents showed that his last meal had included burnt grain, a detail that some scholars have connected to accounts in later Celtic literature of the selection of a sacrifice by lot, the unlucky recipient of the burnt piece. He had also eaten mistletoe pollen, which does not appear to have been a normal dietary item, and which some researchers have suggested may have been consumed as part of a ritual. He had been killed approximately 2,000 years ago. The dating of his death places him in the period of Roman expansion into Britain, possibly during the period of Druidic resistance to Roman conquest. The triple death, the application of multiple methods of killing to a single victim, appears in medieval Irish and Welsh literature as a specifically ritual form of killing. The accounts describe it as a sacrifice of particular power. 3 deaths for a single individual, 3 offerings in one. Lindow Man was not the only body found in the bogs of Britain and Ireland. Hundreds of bog bodies have been discovered across northwestern Europe. Many of them show evidence of violent death. Many of them, like Lindow Man, were well-nourished individuals whose deaths do not suggest execution of criminals. Many of them were found in areas associated with major Druidic ritual sites. The pattern is consistent enough that most scholars today accept that at least some of these bodies represent ritual sacrifice. The details vary. The practice appears to have varied by region and by period. But the Roman accounts of Druidic human sacrifice are no longer dismissed as propaganda by the mainstream of Celtic archaeology. They were not entirely lying. But the ritual killing was only one dimension of the Druidic practice that disturbed the Romans. What disturbed them equally, though they wrote about it less, was the prophetic tradition. The Druids were diviners. They read the future, or claimed to, through multiple forms of augury: the flight of birds, the behavior of animals, the patterns of natural phenomena. And according to the Roman sources, through the observation of human death, the sacrifice and the divination were connected. The victim was not killed simply as an offering. The death itself was a form of communication with the other world, a way of reading information that the normal world could not provide. The convulsions of a dying person, the patterns of blood flow from a wound, the configuration of organs exposed in the body, these were texts that the trained Druid could read. This combination, the intellectual sophistication of the astronomical and legal and historical knowledge, the genuine learning of the 20-year training, combined with practices of divination and sacrifice that the Romans found both repellent and frightening, is what made the Druids so difficult for Rome to categorize. They were not simply savages performing blood rituals. They were not simply philosophers pursuing abstract wisdom. They were both, simultaneously, in ways that the Roman intellectual framework had no comfortable category for. And they were powerful in ways that the Romans could not ignore. There are accounts in Roman sources of Druidic curses that produced effects that the writers found difficult to explain. Accounts of Druidic intervention in battles that changed their outcomes in ways that seemed to go beyond the physical. Accounts of sacred sites where Roman soldiers refused to go, not because of military resistance, but because of something they experienced there that they could not describe. We cannot know how much of this was supernatural in any meaningful sense. We can know that the Romans took it seriously, that they did not dismiss the Druidic ritual tradition as mere superstition, that they treated the Druids as genuinely dangerous in ways that went beyond their political influence. The morning on the Menai Strait, when the Roman legionaries froze at the sight of the assembled Druids, is not the behavior of men confronting something they dismiss as primitive nonsense. It is the behavior of men confronting something they fear. The destruction of the Druids was a process that unfolded over more than a century, and it was deliberate. Caesar's conquest of Gaul between 58 and 50 BCE was the first phase, 8 years of war that killed approximately 1 million Gauls and enslaved another million. The social structure that supported the Druids, the tribal aristocracy, the networks of patronage and obligation, the pan-tribal institutions, was systematically dismantled. The Druids of Gaul did not disappear immediately, but the world they depended on was destroyed. The Emperor Augustus, who ruled after Caesar, issued the first formal legal prohibition of Druidic practice in Rome's territories. The specific terms of the prohibition are not entirely clear from the surviving sources. It applied to Roman citizens and was enforced enough to drive Druidic practice underground in Gaul. The Emperor Claudius, who ruled from 41 to 54 CE, issued a more comprehensive prohibition that appears to have applied to all inhabitants of Roman territories, not just citizens. By the mid-1st century CE, Practicing Druidry in the Roman-controlled parts of Gaul and Britain was a crime. But prohibition is not the same as elimination. They concentrated in areas that were difficult for Rome to reach and to govern. Britain, particularly its western and northern extremities. The island of Anglesey, Mona in Latin, off the northwest coast of Wales. Anglesey was the most sacred site in the Druidic world, or it had become so by the mid-1st century, perhaps because it was the most protected. An island, accessible only by water, in a part of Britain that Rome had not yet fully pacified. A place where the sacred groves could be maintained, where training could continue, where the knowledge that was being destroyed everywhere else could still be preserved. The governor of Britain, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, decided in 61 CE to deal with it directly. The march to Anglesey was itself a feat of logistics. The Menai Strait, the narrow stretch of water separating Anglesey from the Welsh mainland, had to be crossed. Paulinus built flat-bottomed boats for the infantry. The cavalry swam across with their horses. Tacitus, in his Annals, describes what the soldiers saw when they reached the strait and looked across at the opposite shore. The bank was lined with a dense array of armed warriors. Among them, running between the battle lines, were women in black robes with their hair loose and disheveled, carrying torches. Around and among the warriors, raising their hands to the sky and calling down curses, were Druids. The Roman soldiers froze. Tacitus says that they stood motionless, as if their limbs were paralyzed, exposing their bodies to the enemy's blows. Then, urged by their general and by each other not to fear a troop of frenzied women, they advanced and cut down all resistance, wrapping the defenders in their own flames. The sacred groves were destroyed after the battle. The altars that stood in them, altars stained with human blood, Tacitus says, were demolished. The religious sites that had been the center of Druidic practice in Britain were erased. The massacre at Anglesey was interrupted almost immediately by news that should have come as no surprise to anyone paying attention. Boudica, queen of the Iceni tribe in what is now East Anglia, had launched a revolt. Her army had sacked Camulodunum, modern Colchester, the Roman capital of Britain. It was heading for London. Paulinus had to turn his army around and march back across Britain to deal with the revolt. The campaign against the Druids was unfinished. The heart had been cut out. What happened to the Druids after Anglesey? This is where the historical record becomes fragmentary and the archaeology becomes essential. The Roman sources stopped talking about the Druids as a functioning institution after the 1st century CE. They appear in later sources as figures from the past, diviners consulted by individual Romans, practitioners of a tradition that continued in some form in the unconquered territories of Ireland and Scotland. But as a pan-tribal institution with organized training and political authority, the Druids, as Caesar had described them, were gone. The unconquered territories are key. Rome never fully conquered Ireland. Rome's presence in Scotland was limited and contested. In these places, elements of the Druidic tradition survived in modified forms. In Ireland, the figure of the Fili, the professional poet, the keeper of genealogy and history and sacred lore, preserved elements of the Druidic intellectual tradition in a form that was not identical to the Druidic institution, but that clearly descended from it. The Fili out of medieval Ireland underwent training that, while shorter than the claimed 20 years of Druidic training, still extremely long by any normal standard, up to 12 years in some accounts. They memorized an enormous body of material. They traveled freely across political boundaries. They held a special legal status. When Christianity came to Ireland in the 5th century, brought by Patrick and other missionaries, who did not come with Roman armies but with persuasion and example, it encountered this tradition and negotiated with it rather than simply destroying it. The Irish monks who preserved classical learning through the early medieval period, who illuminated the Book of Kells and the Lindisfarne Gospels, and kept the flame of literacy alive in a Europe that was losing it, were working in monasteries that owed something to the Druidic model of the sacred learned community. The knowledge was not entirely lost, it was transformed. The tree was cut down, but the roots produced something new. The sacred calendar survived too, transformed and renamed, but recognizable. Samhain became the feast of All Saints and All Souls, Halloween and the Day of the Dead. The Church placed its commemoration of the dead precisely on the Celtic festival of the dead, understanding that you cannot simply cancel what people have been doing for centuries at a particular time of year, but that you can redirect it. In bulk became Candlemas, the feast of the purification of the Virgin, celebrated with candles light in the darkness of late winter. Same essential meaning as the Celtic festival of the returning light. Beltane and its fires survived in May Day customs across Western Europe. The maypole, the dancing, the flowers, the fires on hilltops that marked the beginning of summer persisted in folk tradition for centuries after Christianity had officially replaced the religion that had originally lit them. This persistence is not accidental. It reflects something real about the human relationship with the cycle of the year, the need to mark the turning points, the need to gather, to light fires, to acknowledge that winter has ended and summer has begun, and the harvest has been brought in, and the dead must be remembered. These needs are deeper than any specific religion. They preceded the Druids, and they survived the Druids' destruction. What the Druids did was give those needs a form. A precise form calibrated to the astronomical reality of the year's turning, embedded in a rich mythology that connected the human world to the natural world and the natural world to the supernatural. That form was destroyed. The needs remained. The archaeological record has continued to reveal the Druidic world in the decades since Lindow Man was found. At Flag Fen in Cambridgeshire, excavations of a Bronze Age and Iron Age site on the edge of what was once a lake have revealed an extraordinary assemblage of deliberately deposited objects. Weapons with their blades intentionally bent or broken, jewelry, tools, thousands of objects placed in the water over centuries. The site was in use from approximately 1300 BCE to the Roman period. Whatever ritual practice was centered here left a material record of extraordinary richness. At Stonehenge in Norfolk, gold and silver torques, the neck rings that were symbols of high status in the Celtic world, found buried in pits in a pattern that suggests deliberate ritual deposition rather than simple hiding. Some of the torques were deliberately damaged before deposition. The hoards at Stonehenge represent a concentration of wealth that is almost inexplicable in any terms other than religious offering. At Lindow Man, on Anglesey itself, the island that Paulinus attacked, the heart of the Druidic world. A cache of metalwork was found in 1943 during the construction of an airfield. Swords, shields, spears, horse fittings, slave chains, cauldrons, all deposited in what had been a lake over a period of several centuries. The quality and quantity of the objects suggests that this was a major votive site, a place where the most valuable objects available were offered to the supernatural powers of the water. The material culture of the Druidic world is emerging from the ground piece by piece, decade by decade. It is rich, it is sophisticated. It is, in its way, as complex and as revealing as any written archive. But it cannot replace what was memorized and carried in human minds and died when those minds died. There is a particular kind of historical tragedy that is different from the tragedy of battle or disaster. It is the tragedy of deliberate erasure. It's of knowledge that existed, that was cultivated over generations, that was specifically targeted for destruction because it was powerful and because the people who held it could not be controlled while they held it. The Druids were not destroyed because they were dangerous in a military sense. The Celtic warriors were dangerous in a military sense, and Rome defeated them by military means. The Druids were destroyed because they were dangerous in a different sense, because they held knowledge that the Roman world could not access, as they commanded authority that the Roman world could not co-opt, because they were the connective tissue of a civilization that Rome wanted to absorb. And you cannot absorb a civilization while leaving its intellectual and spiritual leadership intact. Rome was pragmatic about religion in almost every other context. They absorbed the gods of the peoples they conquered. They permitted local religious practices across the empire. They were, by the standards of the ancient world, relatively tolerant of religious diversity. The persecution of the Christians in the first 2 centuries CE was exceptional rather than typical of Roman religious policy. The exception for the Druids was total, not tolerance, not absorption, extermination. This tells you something about what the Romans understood the Druids to be. Not a religious practice that could be tolerated or absorbed, source of power and knowledge that was incompatible with Roman rule and had to be eliminated. They were right about the incompatibility. They succeeded in the elimination. The modern Druidic revival began in the 18th century. Men like William Stuckley, the English antiquarian, became fascinated with ancient monuments like Stonehenge and Avebury and connected them, without solid historical basis, to the Druids. The connection between the Druids and Stonehenge is not supported by the archaeology. Stonehenge was built long before the Celtic cultures that produced the Druids, but the association stuck. The revival created a romanticized version of the Druids, robed, bearded, conducting ceremonies at ancient stone circles, connected to nature and wisdom and the sacred feminine. This version has very little to do with the actual historical institution. It is a modern spiritual movement that has borrowed the name and some of the symbolism of the ancient order and built something new. The modern Druids are not the ancient Druids. This is not a criticism. It is simply a historical fact. The ancient order died. What we have today is a reconstruction, a reimagining, a creative act of cultural recovery that fills some of the space left by the destruction. The actual knowledge, the 20 years of memorized material, the precise rituals, the full cosmological system, the legal codes, the historical traditions is gone. It died on the shores of Anglesey. It died in the burning of the sacred groves of Gaul. It died in the systematic killing of the people who held it. What we have is the fragments, the bog bodies, the votive deposits, the medieval Irish and Welsh texts that preserve echoes of the older tradition, the Roman accounts, biased and incomplete but irreplaceable, the place names across the Celtic world that preserve traces of the sacred geography, the folk customs that are the secularized remnants of the ritual calendar. From these fragments, scholars have reconstructed an outline, sense of what the Druidic world was and what it practiced and what it believed. The outline is real. It is supported by evidence. But it is an outline, not a complete picture. The complete picture died with the last Druid who held it. Return to that morning on the Menai Strait. The Roman soldiers standing on the shore, looking across the water at something that stopped them cold. The black-robed women with torches. The Druids with their hands raised to the sky, calling down curses in a language the soldiers did not understand. What did they see that froze them? Tacitus gives us the image, but not the experience. We cannot know what it felt like to stand on that shore and look across that water on that morning. But we can infer something. The Roman soldiers who froze were not naive. They were not superstitious in the simple sense. They had seen every kind of enemy that the ancient world produced. They had faced armies larger than this one. They had fought in foreign lands with foreign gods and foreign practices, and had generally treated all of it as simply another variety of the universal human experience of war. Something about what they saw on the opposite shore was different. Something about it reached past their training and their experience and their rationality and produced the reaction that Tacitus describes: the freezing, the motionlessness, the need to be urged by their officers to advance. The Druids, at the end of their world, called down everything they had, every ritual, every accumulated knowledge, every connection to the powers they had served and tended for generations. They stood on the shore of their sacred island, and they called down the curses in the language that held their knowledge, and they faced the end with everything they had. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. Roman iron against ritual knowledge. Roman organization against sacred tradition. The outcome was determined before the boats crossed the water. But for a moment, on that shore, the Roman soldiers stopped. For a moment, 2,000 years ago, the accumulated knowledge of a civilization reached across water and produced a reaction in the most powerful military force the ancient world had ever produced. They burned the groves, they killed the priests, they unmade what had taken centuries to build. In the knowledge that had been held in human minds across all those centuries, the 20 years of training, repeated generation after generation, the astronomy, and the law, and the sacred poetry, and the rituals, and the cosmology, that knowledge went into the fire with the groves, did not come out the other side. We are left with the fragments, the bog bodies, the golden torques in the river mud, the echo of the festivals and the holidays we still observe without knowing why we observe them, the place names, the folk tales, the shadows of something that was once complete and is now broken. And the question that the historical record cannot answer, not what they did. We know something of what they did. Not what they believed, We know something of what they believed, but what they knew. What was in those 20 years of memory? What was in the groves that the Romans burned? That was the real loss, not the people. People died as all people die. The loss is the knowledge. The specific, cultivated, hard-won knowledge of a tradition that spent centuries learning to read the world in ways that we no longer have access to. Rome won. The Druids lost. What was lost with them was something that cannot be recovered. No matter how carefully we dig, or how many bog bodies we find, or how many Celtic texts we translate. The last Druid who held the complete knowledge died on that shore, or shortly after. And with that last death, something went out of the world, something that has never come back, and probably never will.